Bullied by students and ignored by teachers, a black boy uncovered a twisted surprise in his locker, and what happened next shook the entire school to its core. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching this from? The morning sun filtered through the faded curtains in Justin's small bedroom, casting long shadows on the walls. The soft hum of the alarm clock buzzed in the background, signaling the start of yet another school day. Justin lay still in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the seconds before the alarm would go off again. He wasn't in a rush to get up. Every morning felt the same, an endless cycle of dread as he prepared himself for another day at school, where each hallway was filled with whispers, cruel jokes, and sideways glances. The sound of birds chirping outside was a stark contrast to the heaviness that weighed on his chest. His room was a safe space, the only place where he didn't have to worry about how others saw him, the only place where he didn't have to defend the color of his skin or his existence. His room was small, but full of little details that meant the world to him. Posters of his favorite basketball players covered the walls, and his desk was cluttered with textbooks, notebooks, and a well-worn copy of a novel his father had given him before he passed. A reminder of better days, of a time when he didn't feel like he had to prove his worth just to exist. Reluctantly, Justin turned off the alarm and pulled himself out of bed. His mother had already left for her first job, leaving him a note on the kitchen counter, wishing him a good day and reminding him to eat breakfast. He smiled softly at the thought of her, always caring, even when she had little energy left to spare. She worked 2 jobs just to keep the roof over their heads, and Justin knew how much she depended on him to stay out of trouble and do well in school. That was the least he could do for her. He grabbed his clothes from the back of the chair, neutral colors, nothing flashy, nothing that would draw attention. Attention was the last thing he wanted. If he could just make it through the day without being noticed, it would be a victory. But deep down, he knew that wasn't going to happen. School wasn't a place where he could blend in, not when he was one of the few black students in a mostly white school. Walking through the halls of his high school felt like walking a tightrope. Every day was a balancing act, avoiding the bullies, the stares, and the casual cruelty that had become a routine part of his life. The minute he stepped off the bus, he could feel the tension creeping up his spine. He could sense the sneers before they even happened, the whispers behind his back, and the occasional shove in the hallway. Today was no different. The first bell rang as Justin walked through the front doors, his head down, shoulders hunched. He kept his eyes on the floor, avoiding eye contact with the clusters of students gathered in groups. Laughter echoed around him, but it was laughter that he wasn't a part of. He wasn't just an outsider because he was quiet or introverted. He was an outsider because of his skin color, and everyone made sure to remind him of that. In class, the usual suspects threw their looks his way. Billy and his group of friends, who always seemed to have a new insult ready for Justin. They were the popular kids, untouchable in their privilege, and their favorite pastime was making Justin feel small. They laughed at his clothes, called him names, and mimicked his accent whenever he spoke in class. The teachers either didn't notice or didn't care. Sometimes it felt like they were part of the problem too. Today, Mrs. Harper, their homeroom teacher, barely glanced in Justin's direction when Billy and his friends started whispering and pointing at him. He had learned to ignore it, or at least pretend to, but each day the weight of their words grew heavier, and Justin could feel it pressing down on him like a storm cloud that never lifted. As the day dragged on, Justin kept his head down and pushed through the routine of classes and lunch in the corner of the cafeteria where no one paid him any mind. He was used to the isolation, used to the cold stares and muttered insults. But something felt off today. There was an energy in the air, something darker, more malicious than usual. He couldn't quite place it, but his instincts told him to be on guard. By the time the last bell rang, signaling the end of the day, Justin was exhausted. Not just physically, but emotionally. He had made it through another day, but just barely. He lingered near his locker, waiting for the hallway to clear out before opening it. He didn't want anyone around when he gathered his things. The less time spent interacting with his classmates, the better. When the hall was nearly empty, Justin finally opened his locker. The door creaked slightly, but what greeted him inside was far worse than anything he had anticipated. A doll, a crude mannequin, was hanging by a noose, tied to the top of his locker. Its skin was painted black, and its lifeless body swayed gently as the door moved. Next to it was a small coiled whip, resting on his books. A sickening feeling washed over Justin, his heart pounding in his chest as the full weight of the image before him sank in. His vision blurred, his breath came in short gasps, and for a moment the world around him disappeared. Who would do something like this? The answer was obvious, but the question still lingered in his mind. He felt his stomach twist into knots as shame and anger battled for control inside him. This wasn't just another prank. This was a message, a threat, and it was meant for him. For a long time, Justin stood frozen in front of his locker, unable to move, unable to think. His mind raced with images of lynchings, stories his grandparents had told him, the history of black people being brutalized and humiliated. And now, here it was, in his locker, mocking him. He wanted to scream, to run, to fight back, but he couldn't. He was trapped by the fear, by the knowledge that no one would do anything about it. The hallway was empty now. No one had seen what was inside his locker, no one but him. He could throw it all away, pretend it never happened. But deep down, Justin knew that ignoring this wouldn't make it go away. Tomorrow, the taunts would get worse. The whispers would grow louder. And this was only the beginning. With trembling hands, Justin slowly reached up and took down the doll. His fingers brushed against the rough rope, and a cold shiver ran down his spine. He stared at it for a moment longer before tossing it in the trash bin beside him. The whip followed. He slammed his locker shut, breathing heavily, trying to steady himself. His mind screamed for him to do something, to tell someone, but the fear of being dismissed, of being told it was just a joke, stopped him. He knew how it would go. They would laugh it off, tell him he was overreacting. No one would care. No one ever did. Justin slung his backpack over his shoulder and walked out of the school, his feet heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The world outside seemed unchanged, the sky still bright, the trees still swaying in the breeze. But for Justin, everything had changed, and he had no idea what to do next. Justin stood frozen on the sidewalk outside the school, his mind reeling from what he had just seen in his locker. The memory of the doll hanging by a noose, the coiled whip next to it, haunted his every thought. He had thrown them away, but the image wouldn't leave him. His heart was still pounding in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He tried to focus on his breathing, but every time he closed his eyes, the scene replayed in his head. He felt paralyzed. His legs carried him automatically toward the bus stop, but his mind was stuck in that moment. The cold, lifeless doll, its painted black skin, and the noose that had been so meticulously tied, it all felt too real, too much like something from a dark chapter in history, and now it had been left for him as if to remind him of his place. Justin's thoughts raced, each one more confusing than the last. Should he have told someone? Should he have confronted the boys who did it? The thought of doing so sent another wave of anxiety washing over him. No, confronting them wasn't an option. They would only laugh, deny it, or worse, make his life even more unbearable. And telling an adult? That idea felt equally impossible. The teachers had already shown their indifference. Mrs. Harper, the principal, they wouldn't take this seriously. They never did. Still, the fear gnawed at him. What if this was more than just a cruel prank? What if it escalated? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. As he waited for the bus, Justin's mind flickered back to a time when things weren't so complicated, when he didn't have to question his place in the world every single day. He thought about his father. The memories were faded, but strong enough to make him smile, if only briefly. His father had been his rock, the person who always told him to stand tall, to be proud of who he was. But how could he stand tall now? How could he be proud when the world around him constantly tried to tear him down? His father wasn't here to guide him, and Justin felt lost. The bus arrived, its brakes hissing as it came to a stop. Justin climbed aboard and found his usual seat near the back, away from the clusters of students who sat in the front, laughing and talking loudly. He slumped down in the seat, pulling his hood over his head, trying to disappear. The sound of the engine and the chatter around him faded into the background as he stared out the window. He didn't want to think anymore, but the thoughts wouldn't stop. As the bus pulled away from the school, a conversation from earlier that day replayed in his mind. Billy and his friends had been unusually quiet, exchanging glances and whispering whenever Justin walked by. He hadn't paid much attention at the time, assuming it was just their usual routine of mocking him. But now it made sense. They had been planning this all along. The doll, the noose, the whip. It was their idea of a joke, a way to remind him that no matter how hard he tried to fit in, he would never be one of them. Justin clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He hated feeling this way. So small, so helpless. He wanted to fight back, to show them that they hadn't broken him. But how? How could he stand up to them when it felt like the whole school was against him? The bus hit a bump in the road, jolting Justin from his thoughts. He blinked and looked around, realizing that they were nearing his stop. He pulled the cord, signaling the driver, and gathered his things. As he stepped off the bus, the weight of what had happened settled back over him like a heavy blanket. His house was only a few blocks away, but the walk felt like miles. He trudged along the sidewalk, each step slower than the last, as if the ground itself was trying to pull him down. By the time he reached his front door, Justin was exhausted. Not just physically, but mentally. He fumbled with his keys, his hands still shaken from earlier. When he finally got the door open, he stepped inside and shut it behind him, leaning against the door for a moment to catch his breath. The silence of the house was both a comfort and a reminder that he was alone. His mother wouldn't be home for hours, and he wasn't sure he wanted to tell her what had happened. She had enough to worry about without adding this to the list. Justin dropped his backpack on the floor and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. He tried to push the thoughts away, to pretend like it hadn't happened, but the fear was still there, gnawing at him. What if it happened again tomorrow? What if it got worse? The idea of facing Billy and his friends again made his stomach churn. He closed his eyes, hoping that sleep might take him away from it all, but instead his mind drifted back to his father. He could almost hear his voice, calm and steady, telling him to be strong, to rise above the hate. But that was easier said than done. His father had been a strong man, someone who commanded respect. Justin didn't feel like that at all. He felt like a target, and today had proven that he was right. The hours passed slowly as Justin lay there, lost in thought. At some point, he must have dozed off because the sound of his phone vibrating on the coffee table startled him awake. He rubbed his eyes and reached for the phone, blinking at the screen. It was a text from his mother, letting him know she'd be late tonight, something about an extra shift at work. Justin stared at the message for a moment before typing back a quick reply. He didn't mention what had happened. There was no point in worrying her. As the evening wore on, the house remained quiet, and Justin found himself alone with his thoughts again. He couldn't stop replaying the moment he opened his locker, the sight of the doll hanging by the noose, the whip coiled like a snake ready to strike. His hands began to tremble again, just thinking about it. He knew he couldn't ignore this, but what could he do? The school wouldn't take it seriously, and going to the authorities felt like an even worse idea. Would they even believe him? Justin's mind spun in circles, each thought more confusing and paralyzing than the last. He had to make a decision, but every option felt wrong. He could confront Billy and his friends, but that would only give them more power. He could tell a teacher, but they would likely brush it off. He could go to the principal, but she had already shown how little she cared about his experiences at school. A wave of frustration and helplessness washed over him, and Justin felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He wiped them away angrily. He didn't want to cry. He didn't want to be weak, but the reality of the situation was too much to handle. He was just a kid trying to get through school, and yet here he was, dealing with something no one should ever have to face. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that he couldn't handle this alone. He needed someone to talk to, someone who would understand what he was going through. But who? His mother would worry too much, the teachers wouldn't care, and his friends, well, he didn't really have any, not at school anyway. He was alone in this, and that was the worst part of all. As night fell, Justin sat in the dark, staring out the window at the quiet street below. The world outside seemed so normal, so peaceful, but inside, he was falling apart. He needed to do something, but what? The fear, the anger, the sadness, it was all too much, and tomorrow he would have to face it all over again. With a heavy sigh, Justin made his way to his room. The familiar surroundings brought little comfort this time. His bed, his posters, his books, they all seemed distant, like they belonged to another life. A life before today. He crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to his chin, hoping that sleep would take him away from the nightmare that had become his reality. But as he closed his eyes, the image of the doll, the noose, and the whip burned into his mind once more, refusing to let him rest. Tomorrow would come too soon, and with it, the weight of the world would once again fall on his shoulders. For now, though, all he could do was wait. Wait for sleep, wait for tomorrow, and wait for whatever came next. The next morning arrived too soon for Justin, and the weight of what he had seen the day before hung over him like a storm cloud. He dragged himself out of bed, moving slowly, as if hoping that time would somehow stop and spare him from facing the world again. But the world didn't stop. The sun rose, the streets buzzed with morning activity, and the school bell would ring whether he was ready or not. Breakfast was a quiet affair. His mother had left early for work again, her usual note on the counter waiting for him. It was a simple reminder to have a good day with a smiley face drawn at the end. Justin's heart ached as he crumpled the note in his hand. She didn't know, and he couldn't bring himself to tell her. He had to deal with this on his own. But a part of him, the part that still clung to a sliver of hope, wanted to believe that there was someone out there who would help. Someone who would listen and take him seriously. Maybe the principal. Maybe she would finally put a stop to all of this. The thought lingered in his mind as he grabbed his backpack and headed out the door. As Justin entered the school, the noise of students chatting, shouting, and laughing filled the hallways. It felt surreal, as if everyone else existed in a different reality, untouched by the fear and anxiety that consumed him. He walked through the halls with his head down, avoiding eye contact the same way he did every day. But this time his steps were heavier, his mind clouded by what was waiting for him at the end of this walk, a conversation he wasn't ready to have. He stood outside the principal's office for a long moment, staring at the closed door. His heart pounded in his chest. What if she didn't believe him? What if she said it was just a joke, that he was overreacting? The thought was enough to make him turn around and leave. But no, he couldn't let this go. If he did, it would never stop. Taking a deep breath, Justin knocked softly on the door. "Come in," came the principal's voice from the other side. Justin opened the door and stepped inside. The principal, Mrs. Harper, was sitting behind her desk, typing on her computer. She looked up briefly as he entered, her expression neutral. "Justin," she said, folding her hands on the desk, "what brings you here?" Justin hesitated, suddenly feeling like a small child in front of an indifferent adult. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clutching the straps of his backpack. I wanted to talk to you about something that happened yesterday," he said quietly. Mrs. Harper tilted her head slightly, waiting for him to continue. "There was something in my locker," he began, trying to find the right words. "A doll hanging by a noose and a whip." For a moment, Mrs. Harper's expression didn't change. She blinked, her hands still folded neatly on the desk. "I see," she said finally. "And do you know who put it there?" Justin shook his head. "No, but I think it was—" He stopped himself, realizing how it would sound if he accused Billy and his friends without any concrete evidence. "I think it was some kids from my class." Mrs. Harper nodded slowly, as if she had heard it all before. "I'm sure it was just a prank," she said, her voice calm but distant. "Kids do silly things sometimes. They don't always realize how their actions might affect others." Justin felt his stomach drop. A prank. That was all she thought this was. A silly, harmless joke. His hands tightened into fists at his sides. "But it wasn't just a joke," he said, his voice rising slightly. "It was a threat." Mrs. Harper raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed by his outburst. "Justin, I understand that it was upsetting for you," she said, her tone gentle but dismissive. "But we have to be careful not to overreact. I'll talk to the students involved, but I'm sure they didn't mean any harm." Her words hit Justin like a punch to the gut. He had come here hoping for justice, for someone to finally take his side. Instead, he was being told to let it go, to move on, as if what had happened didn't matter. Mrs. Harper's phone buzzed on her desk and she glanced at the screen briefly. "I'll keep an eye on things," she said, her tone signaling the end of the conversation. "But for now, try not to worry about it, okay?" Justin stared at her, disbelief washing over him. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came out. What was the point? She wasn't going to listen. No one ever did. Okay, he muttered, turning toward the door. Have a good day, Justin, Mrs. Harper called after him as he walked out of the office, her voice dripping with a practiced politeness. The hallway felt colder as Justin made his way back to class. He kept his head down, trying to ignore the knot in his stomach. He had taken a chance, tried to do the right thing, and it had backfired. Now he felt even more alone than before. As he reached his locker, he saw Billy and his friends down the hall laughing and joking as if nothing had happened. They hadn't been called to the office. There were no consequences. Just like he had feared, Mrs. Harper had brushed it off as a harmless prank. Justin clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. He wanted to scream, to lash out, to make them understand how much this hurt. But he knew that wouldn't solve anything. It would only make things worse. He opened his locker slowly, half expecting to find another sick message waiting for him. But it was empty. The doll and the whip were gone, but the fear and anger remained, burning in the pit of his stomach. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Justin went through the motions, attending his classes, eating lunch alone in the corner of the cafeteria, and enduring the constant whispers and sneers from his classmates. No one mentioned the doll. No one acknowledged what had happened. It was as if it had never existed. By the time the final bell rang, Justin felt like a ghost, drifting through the school without purpose or direction. He packed his things slowly, waiting for the hallway to empty before heading to the bus stop. He didn't want to see Billy and his friends again. Not today. As he sat on the bus, staring out the window, Justin felt the weight of his silence pressing down on him. He had tried to speak up, and it hadn't made a difference. Mrs. Harper hadn't listened. The bullies hadn't stopped. Nothing had changed. He thought about telling his mother, but the idea made his chest tighten. She had enough to worry about without adding his problems to the list. And even if he did tell her, what could she do? She couldn't fight his battles for him. He was on his own. As the bus rumbled toward his stop, Justin rested his head against the window, feeling the cool glass against his skin. His reflection stared back at him, tired and defeated. He hated feeling like this, so powerless, so invisible. But what choice did he have? When the bus reached his stop, Justin stepped off and made his way home, his feet dragging with every step. The familiar streets that once felt like a safe haven now seemed foreign and hostile. The world around him had changed, and he didn't know how to navigate it. As he reached his front door, Justin paused, staring at the worn welcome mat beneath his feet. He knew that once he stepped inside, the world would feel a little smaller, a little quieter. But the fear and anger wouldn't go away. They would follow him inside, lingering in the corners of his mind, waiting for the next time someone decided to remind him of his place. With a heavy sigh, Justin opened the door and stepped inside, closing it behind him. The house was quiet, just as it had been the night before. And just like the night before, Justin felt more alone than ever. Justin's footsteps echoed through the school halls the next morning, his shoulders heavy with the weight of hopelessness. He felt smaller than ever, each step dragging as if the air around him was thicker than usual. His conversation with Mrs. Harper replayed in his mind like a broken record, every dismissive word a reminder of just how little anyone cared. She had shrugged off the pain that had consumed him, labeling it a joke. Now he was back in the same hallways, surrounded by the same people, knowing that nothing had changed. He reached his locker, still half expecting to find another twisted message waiting for him inside. But the locker was empty. No doll, no whip, just books and notebooks neatly stacked as they had been the day before. It was as if the nightmare had never happened. And yet the fear clung to him, refusing to let go. "Hey," a voice called softly from behind him. Justin turned, startled. Standing a few feet away was Oliver, a quiet boy from his class. He wasn't like the others. While the other kids laughed and jeered, Oliver usually stayed on the sidelines, blending into the background. Justin had always thought of him as a ghost, present but invisible. But today, for the first time, Oliver was looking directly at him, his expression hesitant but sincere. "I saw what happened," Oliver said, his voice barely above a whisper. "With your locker, I mean." Justin's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected anyone to acknowledge what had happened, let alone offer any kind of support. "You saw it?" he asked cautiously, unsure whether to feel relieved or wary. Oliver nodded, glancing around nervously, as if worried someone might overhear. "I didn't see them put it there, but I heard them talking about it. Billy and his friends. They planned the whole thing." Justin's stomach churned at the confirmation of what he had already suspected, but hearing it out loud made it feel even more real and even more painful. He clenched his fists, trying to suppress the wave of anger that threatened to overwhelm him. I didn't know what to do," Oliver admitted, shifting his weight awkwardly. "I thought about telling someone, but I was scared." Justin stared at him, the words settling heavily in the space between them. A part of him wanted to be angry at Oliver for staying silent, for not stepping in sooner. But another part of him understood. Oliver was just a kid, like him, caught in the same twisted system that rewarded cruelty and punished kindness. "It's fine," Justin muttered, though it was far from fine. "I get it." Oliver looked down at his shoes, guilt etched across his face. "It's not fine," he said quietly. "What they did was messed up, and I should have said something." Justin didn't respond. He wasn't sure what to say. The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable, until Oliver finally spoke again. "Look, I know I can't fix what happened," Oliver said, his voice soft but earnest. "But I want to help, if you'll let me." Justin blinked, caught off guard by the offer. It had been so long since anyone had offered him anything other than scorn or indifference. The idea of having someone on his side felt foreign, almost unreal. "How?" Justin asked, skepticism creeping into his voice. Oliver glanced around the hallway again, then leaned in closer. "We can catch them," he whispered. "Get proof of what they're doing. If we have evidence, they won't be able to deny it." Justin frowned. "You mean, like, record them?" "Exactly," Oliver said, his eyes lighting up with determination. "We can use my phone. I'll set it up near their usual spot during lunch. They always hang out by the lockers, right? We just need to catch them talking about it." The plan sounded risky. If Billy and his friends found out, things could get even worse, but at the same time it felt like the only option. Justin was tired of being powerless. He was tired of staying silent. "You really think this will work?" Justin asked, still unsure whether to trust Oliver's sudden change of heart. Oliver gave a small, hopeful smile. "It's worth a shot." For the first time in what felt like forever, Justin felt a flicker of hope. It was small, barely noticeable, but it was there, a tiny spark in the darkness. He nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, "let's do it." At lunch, the cafeteria buzzed with noise, students laughing, shouting, and gossiping. Justin sat at his usual spot in the corner, his tray untouched. Across the room, Oliver gave him a small nod, signaling that everything was ready. His phone was hidden just out of sight, tucked behind a stack of books on a nearby table. All they had to do now was wait. Billy and his friends arrived a few minutes later, loud and obnoxious as always. They slouched against the lockers, laughing and cracking jokes, completely oblivious to the fact that they were being recorded. "Did you see his face?" one of them said, snickering. "Priceless." "Man, that was genius," another chimed in. "The noose? Perfect touch." Justin's stomach twisted as the conversation confirmed everything he had feared. They were proud of what they had done, proud of the fear and pain they had caused. He clenched his fists under the table, fighting the urge to storm over there and confront them. Oliver caught his eye from across the room and gave a subtle shake of his head. Not yet. They needed more. As the boys continued to talk, they grew bolder, their words dripping with malice. "Think we should do it again?" Billy asked, grinning. "Maybe next time we'll leave him something even worse." Justin's heart pounded in his chest. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to get up, to do something, to make them stop. But he stayed where he was, his hands trembling with barely contained rage. "Yeah," Billy said with a laugh, "gotta remind him who's in charge." The conversation went on for a few more minutes, each word adding to the pile of evidence they needed. Finally, Oliver gave Justin a quick nod, signaling that they had enough. It was time to go. Justin stood up slowly, his legs feeling shaky beneath him. As he made his way toward the door, he caught one last glimpse of Billy and his friends, still laughing, still so sure of their invincibility. But they wouldn't be laughing for long. When the final bell rang, Justin and Oliver met outside the school, their faces tense but determined. Oliver pulled out his phone and played back the recording, the boys' voices clear and unmistakable. It was everything they needed, a confession, laid out in their own words. "We've got them," Oliver said, a mixture of relief and excitement in his voice. Justin nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. For the first time in a long while, he felt something other than fear. He felt hope. "Now," Oliver said, "we just have to figure out what to do with this." Justin stared at the phone, the weight of the decision settling over him. They had the evidence. They had the power. And for the first time, they had a chance to fight back. The question was, how far were they willing to go? After leaving school, Justin couldn't help but feel a strange mix of excitement and fear. He had never thought that someone like Oliver, quiet, reserved, seemingly invisible, would step in to help him. Now they had real evidence. The recording was their weapon, but using it wasn't going to be easy. The next morning, Justin met Oliver by the school entrance, away from prying eyes. They huddled together near the bike racks, speaking in hushed voices. Oliver held his phone tightly, playing the recording back again. The voices of Billy and his friends were unmistakable, filled with cruelty and glee. Hearing it a second time didn't make it any easier for Justin to stomach. "We need to be smart about this," Oliver said. "If they find out we're the ones who recorded them, it could get ugly." Justin nodded. He knew all too well what Billy and his friends were capable of. They weren't the type to back down quietly. Exposing them meant taking a risk, a big one. "We could show it to the principal," Justin said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew it wasn't a good idea. Oliver shook his head. "She won't do anything. You saw how she handled it last time. She'll probably just give them a warning and call it a day." Justin clenched his fists, frustration bubbling inside him. He was tired of feeling powerless, tired of adults brushing off his experiences as if they didn't matter. But what choice did they have? We could take it to the school board, Oliver suggested, or the media. Justin's heart raced at the thought. The media? That felt too big, too dangerous. What if things spiraled out of control? What if the whole school found out what had happened? It's risky, Justin muttered. What if it makes everything worse? Oliver's expression softened. I know it's scary, but we can't let them get away with this. If we don't do something, they'll just keep doing it. Justin knew he was right. As terrifying as it was, they had to act. Staying silent wasn't an option anymore. They spent the rest of the day laying low, carefully avoiding Billy and his crew. Every glance in their direction felt like a threat, every whispered conversation a potential danger. But Justin kept his head down, knowing that soon things would change. Soon the truth would come out. At lunch, they sat together at a secluded table in the corner of the cafeteria, strategizing. Oliver scrolled through his phone, researching school policies and looking for any leverage they could use. There's a student council meeting tomorrow, Oliver said thoughtfully. We could bring it up there. If we present the evidence in front of everyone, the principal won't be able to ignore it. The idea filled Justin with equal parts dread and determination. Speaking up in front of the entire council was a terrifying thought, but it also felt like the only way to ensure that the truth was heard. We'll need to be careful, Justin said. If Billy and his friends find out before the meeting, they'll try to stop us. Oliver gave a small, reassuring smile. They won't find out. I've got your back. For the first time in a long while, Justin felt a glimmer of hope. They had a plan. It was risky, but it was a chance to finally stand up for himself. And this time, he wasn't alone. That night, Justin lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced with thoughts of the meeting, of what could go wrong, but also of what could go right. He knew the risks. He knew that standing up to his bullies would come with consequences. But the thought of staying silent, of letting them win, was worse. He thought of his father again, of the lessons he had taught him about courage and resilience. His father had always told him that being strong didn't mean never being afraid. It meant doing what was right, even when fear tried to stop you. Justin took a deep breath, feeling a sense of calm settle over him. Tomorrow would be hard, but he was ready. The next day, the tension in the air was palpable as Justin and Oliver entered the school. The hallways buzzed with chatter, but to Justin it all felt distant, like background noise in a dream. His focus was on the meeting, on the moment when they would finally reveal the truth. They arrived early, slipping into the student council room before anyone else. Oliver set up his phone, ready to play the recording when the time came. Justin paced nervously, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never spoken in front of so many people before, especially not about something so personal. "Are you sure about this?" Justin asked, glancing at Oliver. Oliver gave him a steady nod. "We've got this." One by one, the members of the council filed in, chatting and laughing as they took their seats. The principal, Mrs. Harper, entered last, her expression cool and composed. She gave Justin a brief, unreadable glance before taking her place at the head of the table. The meeting began with the usual business, club announcements, upcoming events, but Justin barely heard any of it. His mind was focused entirely on the recording, on the moment when they would finally press play. When the council reached the section for open discussion, Oliver gave Justin a nod. It was time. Justin stood, his hands shaking slightly. He felt every eye in the room turn toward him, but he forced himself to stay calm. This was his moment. "There's something I need to talk about," Justin began, his voice quiet but steady. "It's about something that happened to me here at school." Mrs. Harper's eyes narrowed slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Justin took a deep breath, then nodded to Oliver. Oliver tapped his phone, and the recording began to play. The room fell silent as Billy's voice filled the space, his words dripping with malice. The sound of his laughter, the crude jokes, the threat to do it again, it was all there, laid out for everyone to hear. When the recording ended, the room remained silent for a long moment, the weight of the truth settling over everyone. Justin glanced around, watching as the expressions of the council members shifted from confusion to shock to outrage. Mrs. Harper cleared her throat, her expression carefully neutral. "Thank you, Justin," she said slowly. "We will look into this matter immediately." But the damage had already been done. The council members were murmuring among themselves, their faces a mixture of disbelief and anger. The truth was out, and there was no going back. Justin sat down, his heart pounding in his chest. He had done it. He had finally stood up for himself. And this time, there was no way they could ignore him. The room remained heavy with silence, the weight of Justin's revelation pressing down on everyone present. Mrs. Harper cleared her throat again, visibly uncomfortable as the murmurs among the student council members grew louder. Justin sat with his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his heart still pounding from the adrenaline. This was it. There was no turning back now. "You have our attention, Justin," Mrs. Harper said with a forced calmness. "We'll handle this matter accordingly." But the unease in her voice betrayed her. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected evidence that could put her school under such a glaring spotlight. One of the student council members, a senior named Danielle, leaned forward, her expression incredulous. "Handle it accordingly?" she repeated. "Is that all you have to say? This isn't just a prank. It's hate speech." Others murmured in agreement, and Mrs. Harper shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "We need to take this seriously," Danielle continued, her voice growing stronger. "This kind of behavior can't be ignored." Justin felt a flicker of hope in his chest. For the first time, it seemed like someone other than Oliver was on his side. But Mrs. Harper raised her hand, trying to regain control of the room. "I understand your concerns," she said, her tone tight with frustration, "but we need to handle this internally. We don't want to cause unnecessary alarm." Justin's fists clenched under the table. There it was. The same dismissal, the same attempt to sweep everything under the rug. He had been afraid of this, and now it was happening right in front of him. "No," Justin said, his voice low but firm. The room fell silent again as everyone turned to look at him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, but he refused to back down. This can't stay quiet. They need to be held accountable. Mrs. Harper's jaw tightened. "Justin, we will take appropriate measures." "No, you won't," Oliver interrupted, surprising everyone, including Justin. He sat up straighter, meeting Mrs. Harper's gaze head-on. "You didn't do anything when Justin came to you before. Why should we believe you'll do anything now?" Mrs. Harper opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, Danielle spoke up again. "Oliver's right. If the administration won't act, we'll take it to the school board." The murmurs around the table grew louder, and Mrs. Harper's expression hardened. She could feel her control slipping away. Justin exchanged a glance with Oliver, a silent understanding passing between them. They had done it. They had exposed the truth, and now the ball was rolling, whether Mrs. Harper liked it or not. The fallout began almost immediately. By the end of the day, news of the recording had spread throughout the school. Whispers and rumors filled the hallways, and Justin could feel the weight of every gaze that lingered on him. Some were curious, others sympathetic, but many were hostile, especially from the group of students who had always sided with Billy. Billy and his friends were furious. Justin could see it in their glares, feel it in the tension that followed him everywhere he went, but they didn't approach him directly. Not yet. Oliver stayed close by his side, offering quiet support whenever the stares and whispers became too much. It was strange, having someone to lean on after feeling so alone for so long. But Justin was grateful. He didn't think he could have done this without Oliver. That evening, Justin's phone buzzed with a series of messages from students he barely knew, some offering words of encouragement, others hurling insults and threats. He scrolled through them in silence, feeling a strange mix of emotions. He had known there would be backlash, but it still stung. When he told his mother what had happened, she listened quietly, her expression a mixture of concern and pride. "I'm proud of you, baby," she said, pulling him into a tight hug. "It takes a lot of courage to stand up for yourself." Justin felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. He wasn't used to hearing words like that, not after everything he had been through, but it felt good. It felt right. The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings and phone calls. The school board launched an investigation, and Billy and his friends were called in for questioning. Their parents were furious, demanding to know how such a thing could happen under the school's watch. Mrs. Harper, caught in the middle, scrambled to control the narrative, but it was too late. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back. The investigation revealed not only the incident with the doll, but also a pattern of bullying and negligence that stretched back years. Teachers who had turned a blind eye to harassment were reprimanded, and new policies were put in place to address discrimination and bullying more effectively. Billy was suspended, along with the other students involved in the incident. The suspension sent a clear message: this behavior would no longer be tolerated. For the first time, Justin felt like justice had been served. But it wasn't just the suspension that gave him a sense of closure. It was the knowledge that he had found his voice, that he had refused to let fear silence him. The following week, the principal called a special assembly to address the entire student body. Mrs. Harper stood on stage, her expression somber as she spoke about the importance of respect, kindness, and accountability. But to Justin, her words felt hollow. It was too little, too late. As assembly ended, Justin and Oliver sat together in the back of the auditorium, watching as students filed out. Some glanced their way, others avoided eye contact. But it didn't matter. For the first time, Justin didn't care what they thought. He had done what was right, and that was all that mattered. Oliver nudged him gently. "You okay?" Justin nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Yeah, I think I am." That afternoon, as they walked home together, Justin felt lighter than he had in a long time. The sun was warm on his face, and the air smelled like fresh-cut grass. For the first time in what felt like forever, the world didn't seem so dark. "You know," Justin said, glancing at Oliver, "I never thought I'd say this, but thanks for everything." Oliver grinned. "Hey, what are friends for?" Justin smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. He still had a lot to figure out, a lot to heal from, But with Oliver by his side, he knew he could handle whatever came next. The days following the assembly marked the beginning of a new chapter for Justin. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, he walked through the school hallways without the constant weight of fear pressing down on him. Billy and his friends were gone, suspended and facing consequences for their actions. The whispers and sneers had quieted, replaced by a palpable tension in the air as if everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. But Justin no longer cared about the opinions of those who had once tormented him. He had taken a stand, and now the world looked different. On the surface, not much had changed. Students still gathered in their cliques. Teachers still droned on during class, and the school's routine remained the same. But for Justin, everything felt new. His footsteps felt lighter, his shoulders no longer hunched from the burden of carrying secrets and shame. He moved through the halls with a quiet confidence that hadn't been there before, and though he wasn't fully healed, he knew he was on the right path. Oliver remained by his side, their bond stronger than ever. It was strange how quickly things had changed between them. Just weeks ago, Oliver had been nothing more than a quiet presence in the background, and now he was one of the most important people in Justin's life. They spent their days together, walking home after school, talking about everything and nothing, as if they had been friends for years. "Are you ready for the graduation ceremony next month?" Oliver asked one afternoon as they walked home under the soft glow of a spring sunset. Justin shrugged, a small smile playing on his lips. "I guess. It feels weird, like it came out of nowhere." "Yeah, but you made it," Oliver said with a grin. "After everything, you're still here. That's gotta feel good." Justin glanced at him, a thoughtful expression crossing his face. "It does," he admitted. "I didn't think I'd make it through this year. There were times when I felt like, I don't know, like everything was stacked against me." Oliver nodded, his expression serious. "I get that. But you did it. You stood up to them, and now you're here." Justin's thoughts drifted back to everything that had happened. The taunts, the cruel jokes, the doll hanging in his locker like a symbol of everything he had feared for so long. The fear and anger still lingered inside him, like a bruise that hadn't fully healed, but it no longer controlled him. He had fought back, and that made all the difference. As the weeks passed, the school board's investigation led to sweeping changes in the school's policies. Anti-bullying programs were introduced, teachers underwent sensitivity training, and new rules were established to prevent any future incidents of harassment. Mrs. Harper's indifferent handling of the situation didn't go unnoticed, and though she wasn't removed from her position, she was put under strict scrutiny by the district. It was a small victory, but one that mattered. Billy and his friends, after serving their suspension, returned to school, but they were no longer the untouchable figures they once were. The power they had wielded over others had crumbled, and they were watched closely by both teachers and students. They no longer dared to bother Justin, and though their presence still sent a shiver down his spine, Justin knew that they couldn't hurt him anymore. He had taken away their power. The day of the graduation ceremony arrived, and the school's gymnasium buzzed with excitement. Students dressed in their caps and gowns milled around, talking, laughing, and posing for photos with their families. The stage at the front of the gym was decorated with flowers and banners, a symbol of new beginnings and the closing of one chapter of their lives. Justin stood at the back of the room, adjusting his cap nervously. His mother was sitting in the audience, her smile bright and proud as she waved at him. Justin waved back, his heart swelling with emotion. She had worked so hard to get him to this point, and today was as much her victory as it was his. As the ceremony began, the principal and faculty gave their speeches, offering words of wisdom and encouragement to the graduating class, but Justin barely heard any of it. His mind was elsewhere, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. When his name was finally called, Justin walked across the stage, his heart pounding in his chest. The applause that filled the room was a blur, the faces in the crowd indistinct. But when he reached the other side and accepted his diploma, he felt a sense of accomplishment that went far beyond just finishing high school. This was a victory not just over the bullies who had tormented him, but over the fear that had once controlled his life. After the ceremony, as students and families gathered outside to take photos and celebrate, Justin found himself standing quietly by the edge of the field, watching the sun set on the horizon. The sky was a mixture of oranges and pinks, the colors blending together in a soft glow. It felt like the perfect end to a long and difficult chapter of his life. Oliver joined him a moment later, holding 2 cups of punch in his hands. He handed one to Justin, a grin on his face. "We did it," Oliver said, clinking his cup against Justin's. "Yeah," Justin said, taking a sip. "We did." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the other students celebrated with their families. Laughter filled the air and the mood was light and joyful. But for Justin, it was a quiet, reflective moment, a time to think about everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. "You know," Justin said after a while, "I used to think that things would never get better, that no matter what I did, people like Billy would always have the upper hand." "And now?" Oliver asked, glancing at him. Justin smiled, a calm, steady smile that came from deep inside. "Now, I know that things can change. It's not easy, but it's possible." Oliver nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You stood up for yourself, man. That's something a lot of people never do." "I didn't do it alone," Justin said, giving him a grateful look. "You helped me. I couldn't have done any of this without you." Oliver shrugged, his cheeks turning slightly red. "Hey, that's what friends are for, right?" Justin laughed, the sound light and free. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe easily. The pain and fear were still there, but they were manageable now, like shadows that faded in the light of day. And with Oliver by his side, Justin knew that he didn't have to face the future alone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a soft twilight, Justin took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs. He had come so far, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, he was ready to face it. He had learned that strength didn't come from pretending everything was okay. It came from standing up, even when it felt impossible. "Ready to get out of here?" Oliver asked, glancing at him with a smile. "Yeah," Justin said, smiling back. "Let's go." Together, they walked away from the school, the sounds of celebration fading behind them. The world felt wide and full of possibilities, and for the first time in a long time, Justin wasn't afraid of what came next. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss new videos. Support the channel. It inspires us to make even more interesting stories. And don't forget to check out the other videos on the channel. We're sure you'll find something there that will hook you. See you in the next stories.